Hello, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Carolyn Lawrence, and I am the Director of Corporate Development for APICS. Joining me today on the broadcast is John Brandt, founder and CEO of the MPI Group. We're excited that you're joining us today as we share insight on achieving superior operational performance in the pharmaceutical industry. Just a bit of housekeeping. For the remainder of the broadcast, you are all in listen-only mode. We have included time prior to the end of the session to answer questions. Please type your question in the question box located in the panel on your screen as we move through the presentation. If we are unable to answer all of the questions prior to the end of the broadcast, we will follow up with answers to all of your queries. During our time together today, we will be looking specifically at the current state of the pharmaceutical industry, both qualitatively and quantitatively. As the premier professional association for supply chain management, APICS knows the journey to transform supply chains to gain business value with both top and bottom line results. Standard metrics and best-in-class benchmarks, like those we will discuss today, play a pivotal role in creating supply chain excellence. However, to gain full business value, companies need to implement not only performance, but also organization, process, and people improvements. The APICS for Business value proposition has integrated products and services that can be configured to unbiased, standardized, customer-centric implementation solutions to deliver that business value. Supply chain management and transformation usually begins with an assessment at the individual supply chain level. Studies in the last 20 years have shown that the assessment of any supply chain typically follows an implementation roadmap like the one shown here. It requires engaging a cross-functional team led by a respected supply chain leader and supported by an active executive sponsor who defines a burning platform, aligns the program with business strategy, and ultimately provides resources. The team develops a strategic pilot, puts together a charter for that pilot that includes scope, objectives, team, and schedule. Performance, practices, process, and people are analyzed to develop a baseline. This is where our benchmarking, like the one we're going to discuss today, becomes so valuable. Once performance gaps are identified, organizations like yours can develop and implement a focused project portfolio that will provide a definitive return on your investment while being tied to the overall company's strategic goals. The key we have learned is to think big, act small, and scale implementation fast. As I mentioned in the previous slide, benchmarks and best practices are critical to understanding the current state and performance gaps of your strategic supply chain. To share with you exciting benchmarking research recently conducted in the pharmaceutical industry, I am excited to introduce John Brandt, CEO and founder of the MPI Group. John has devoted more than 2 decades to studying leadership in effective, purpose-driven organizations. As an expert on how companies can adapt themselves to the realities of new markets, new corporate structures, and new customer expectations, John is an accomplished management innovator and an internationally recognized expert on manufacturing and technology. Before founding the MPI Group in 2003, John was the publisher and editor-in-chief of Industry Week magazine, which garnered more than 70 editorial awards of excellence and doubled its revenue under his leadership. Additionally, John served as the president, publisher, and editor-director of the Chief Executive Group, where his leadership transformed the magazine into one of the publishing's most surprising comebacks. A frequent lecturer around the globe on topics ranging from leadership and customer value to management best practices and building world-class communities, John is the recipient of the prestigious Neal Award and has served as a member of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership National Advisory Board and a judge for the National Association of Manufacturers Awards for Workforce Excellence. He currently serves as the co-chair of the Northeast Ohio Product Innovation Initiative, is an advisory board member of both SupplierInsight.com and Ken Tool Manufacturing, is director of the Work in Northeast Ohio Council, and is the president of the Press Club of Cleveland. Please join me in welcoming John Brandt.
Carolyn, thank you very much. Delighted to be with everyone today. We're going to talk a little bit about an industry that is growing very rapidly, but maybe has some productivity issues and some improvement methodology issues that aren't moving quite as fast. So I want to talk a little bit about that today and some research that we've recently completed. So we have got an industry here that is growing incredibly rapidly right now. And it's growing incredibly rapidly due to advances in medical care, advances in worldwide growth, and improved access to health care around the world. It's amazing when you take a look at this industry. Global medicine spending is projected to reach $1.3 trillion by 2018, which is an increase of about $300 billion from just 2013. That is a massive, massive increase. The biggest per capita increase, probably no surprise to everyone on this call, is going to happen in the United States, and U.S. spending on prescription drugs in 2015, last year, was $425 billion. And there are lots and lots of medications and drugs and pharmaceuticals out there, but when you get a really big medication, it is really, really big dollars. Harvoni, $14.3 billion, Humira, over $10 billion, Enbrel, over $6 billion, Crestor, $6 billion, Lantus Solistar, almost $6 billion. These are massive, massive expenditures in the healthcare arena, and there are massive opportunities for pharmaceutical companies. And that is driving a construction boom. And this is not really well commented on, but as the need for drugs has risen over the last several years, manufacturing plants are rising in fields as well. If you look for over the period, a 15-year period from 99 to 2014, the number of pharmaceutical and medicine manufacturing establishments and facilities grew by almost 20%. And that's even more amazing when you look at the fact that the number of manufacturing facilities overall actually declined 20%. So you've got something that is not just defying the trend, is really just outside the norm for manufacturing. Not surprisingly, the number of employees has risen pretty dramatically too. Number of employees over that same 15-year period rose by 8%, and that's versus a 31% decline in overall manufacturing. Absolutely amazing growth in this sector. And this sector, again, this will not be a surprise to everyone, this is a sector that requires massive, overwhelming investment. You've got billions of R&D dollars that are spent every time a new drug comes out for thousands of screening, years of clinical testing, hundreds of millions of dollars to build a specialized plant, and then even once these plants are up running, there's lots of expenditures, which is why it's a little surprising when you take a look at the sort of the lack of progress in some areas within pharmaceutical manufacturing in terms of improvement methodology, supply chain management, etc. And that's really, really surprising given the fact that so many of these companies are holding patents that are going to expire relatively quickly, and they need to make sure that they're getting their manufacturing up and running and profitable in a way that they can optimize the revenue streams and their profits from this. The peak year, when you take a look at these patents for patents that were expiring, was in 2012, when loss of exclusivity affected so many drugs that it was $48 billion worth of revenues that went off patent. And those included Lipitor and Plavix. When you look at this chart here, you can just see that every year you've got companies that are looking at having patents that are going to expire and their exclusivity is going to go away, which makes it all the more imperative to make sure that they are managing their firm's production, distribution, supply chains in ways that allow them to optimize profitability during the time when they have that exclusivity. So that's kind of where we're at. So let's just take a look at, when you get down, you're looking at actual facilities, how are they doing? And what we find is we know that across manufacturing, plant reliability is vital to having products in market and market availability. And the difficult thing about this industry is that when you look at machine availability rates, they underperform manufacturing in general. When you look at the averages here, the average in this industry is 54% for machine availability, versus almost 79%, 78%, 79% for the rest of manufacturing. And that number, you can explain that a little bit when you start looking at some of the other numbers on this chart here. You've got pharmaceutical plants devoting 10% or more on average of their upkeep to unplanned maintenance. So meaning things are breaking down, things aren't happening. And the problem with unplanned maintenance is that you don't have just the maintenance cost, obviously. You are affecting your flow, your profitability, and your value streams across not just the plant, but across everything that those touches, whether it's supply chain or distribution or retailer out into the field. And this is really critical because even with these sort of poor numbers on machine availability and unplanned maintenance, these are plants that are reporting very high production volumes. If you look at the average there at that 80%, and a significant improvement in volume usage over the last 3 years. And when you look at the return on capital invested, you see that it is up at about 26% on average versus 21% several years ago. So an industry that is doing well, but is probably leaving some money on the table by not managing some of these other issues. And some of those issues are driven quite reasonably by concerns about product quality. And no one on this call is going to suggest that product quality isn't really important. The problem is that sometimes this product quality is not being managed in ways that are leading edge with improvement methodologies and that. You've got intense scrutiny from the FBA. You're subject to the current good manufacturing practice regulations. And because of that, you see that sometimes plants are reporting relatively modest first pass yield performance, 92% average, much worse than most of manufacturing. Why is that happening? Well, in part because it comes at the expense of a very high scrap and rework rate. And it's understandable, especially because when you look at small plants, a lot of times when they've got a batch of product, they will dump it even when the quality problem is isolated only to a very small amount of that. And we're going to see that in some of the inventory issues we're going to look at later. And yet, even with this intense focus on quality, even with dumping, doing scrap and rework, there were still 2,000 drug recalls in the US last year. And 105 of those were Class 1 recalls. And that's a situation in which there's a reasonable probability that something really, really bad is going to happen. So clearly the way that these plants are managing themselves with improvement methodologies and quality is not quite working in a way that is both protective of the public and working for their bottom lines. We are seeing some improvements in productivity. Manufacturing cycle time has decreased over a 3-year period. It was at 94 on average 3 years ago, is down to 77 now. That obviously then helps on-time delivery rates, which improved from 90.6 to 91.8. That's a pretty good improvement over a 3-year period. Again, a little behind some of the some other areas in manufacturing. And as I mentioned before, despite some of these issues with improvement methodologies, productivity, quality, et cetera, the cost structures generally outperform, and that's partly because of the patent exclusivity. You've got productivity, which we measure by sales per employee, is significantly higher than manufacturing in general, 430,000 versus about $250,000 on average. But you're going to see that that varies widely in this industry. And maybe of more concern is the fact that only 17% of plants increased their productivity in this industry over the last year, despite the fact that cost of goods sold as a percentage of plant revenues is better than overall manufacturing. So you've got an industry that is set up to generate great revenues, great profits, especially when the patents are exclusive, but you've got plants that have some issues that could be managed if they were managing a little bit differently. So let's talk about some of those issues and some of those best practices that are present, and maybe even more importantly, some of those best practices that are not present. We found when we looked at this industry that most facilities have adopted some sort of improvement methodology, whether it's lean, theory of constraints, Six Sigma, et cetera, et cetera. And as a matter of fact, we saw that lean manufacturing, according to these plants, was in place at 86% of them. And we had close to 60% that reported that they've made significant progress toward world-class manufacturing status. And you've got another 40% that said they've made some progress. So that's the good news, sort of at the overall, the 30,000-foot level. We always then, though, like to delve down and take a look at specific best practices in which you would think would need to be there to support some of these other things. What you find that when you look at things like benchmarking or continuous improvement, yeah, it's in place at about 70% of plants, 70, 71%. you start looking at other specific best practices that you would hope to see at a facility that was trying to improve, things like quality certifications or value stream mapping, Kaizen events, total productive maintenance, open book management, things like that. They're all well under 50%, and some of them, the PDCA problem solving or open book management, at 0%. So what you're seeing here is that you've got a recognition that, yes, we should have an improvement methodology. It's unclear how deep that improvement methodology or how extensively that has been implemented at many of these plants. We think that if you're looking at this industry or if you're managing in this industry, one of the things, there is some benchmarking going on. We think process quality in particular, though, could benefit by taking a look at and benchmarking some other industries. For example, in this industry, we see processes that do not translate very well from the R&D lab once they get into manufacturing on the plant floor. You've got designers who are under pressure to get drugs ready, get them tested, get them out quickly because of the limits on patent exclusivity, and yet they may not be using quality gates to make sure that they've got a scaled-up design for manufacturability. It's, it may be great they get this ready to go, but manufacturing is not quite ready yet. We don't see factories in this industry applying error proofing very effectively, which leads to a lot of scrap and rework, et cetera, especially when maybe there's only a small part of a batch that needed to be thrown away. We see also in this industry that standardization of work, standardization of processes and equipment doesn't happen as much as it could, especially across different sites. And then we see, when you take a look at specifications for things that aren't crucial to product quality and safety, sometimes there's insufficient validation of those, or the criteria are sort of tight for no general reason, which leads to a lot of secondary processing, a lot of testing, and a lot of yield loss, which directly affects productivity and directly affects profitability. When you look at pharmaceutical plants that are doing a good job in this area, that are managing in more effective ways or leading ways, you see that they are generally focusing on 10 things. And those are taking a look at their quality metrics, they're making sure they're benchmarking, they're organizing their operating expenses and excellence, they're taking a look at their operating excellence maturity, figuring out how they can manage complexity, making a big focus on shifting from just machinery and tools or specific improvement tools to developing a culture of improvement and a culture of focus on process and process improvement. Operating excellence, making a focus that they're getting the right leaders in place, and how do we get leaders at every level throughout the organization. Continuous improvement culture, and making sure that when you're looking at operating excellence, you are not looking at it in isolation. You are just looking at it, you are looking at it across facilities, across an entire network, across the entire value stream that leads into the plant and leads out of it, out to the consumer. That's what we see great plants doing. What we see many plants, most plants in this industry doing, are things that they're not taking effective steps to manage their inventory. For example, when we look at this industry, 5% of a plant's total inventory is typically obsolete already, 5%. And that's not surprising when you take a look at the inventory best management practices that you would think would be in place. Look at all these. These are all in place at under 50% of plants. RFID or computerized inventory, pull systems, quick equipment changeovers, just-in-time deliveries, parts and goods supermarkets, vendor managed or supplier inventories. They're under 50% or even down to 0%, which means you've just got people who aren't managing in ways that, frankly, many other manufacturing industries are managing. And there is no reason that most of these could not be easily adopted within pharmaceutical plants. For example, if you look at trying to figure out how to do lean manufacturing, which if you go back to that slide I was on before, we're going to talk about Merck, but many of these are common within lean manufacturing, which you've got 86% of plants saying they're doing lean, but they don't seem to be implementing the practices, whether it's Kanban signals, OnePiece Flow techniques, et cetera, that you would typically associate with lean. So when you look at Merck, what they wanted to do was figure out, okay, how can we improve our manufacturing? How can we make sure that we make our processes more flexible, more efficient, more responsive? And what they did, they started off with figuring out how to deploy a common ERP framework across their global operations, and then really started getting down and doing the lean work, developing standardized business processes. And like most successful process improvement programs or lean programs, they've made sure that they started with a pilot project. And they did this in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, at their plant there. They did value stream mapping. Again, you would think that if these plants are doing lean, they would have done this, but many have not done this yet. And they found that most of the waste in their processes came from long campaign-based production practices, meaning, okay, we're going to just make a whole bunch of this stuff instead of figuring out, well, what do we actually need to make, how does demand fluctuate, et cetera, and a lack of doing standardized changeover processes, meaning there just wasn't, nobody had documented how do we do this well and how do we do it quickly over and over again. So what they did is after they did the value stream mapping and identified those two problems, they moved from what had been a very rigid monthly production schedule to a flexible schedule that was driven actually by customer demand, as you would see in many other industries. They also incorporated continuous just-in-time production flow, which was triggered by these demands, and they saw tremendous benefits from this. They reduced production-related inventory by as much as 30%. They reduced their overall operating expenses at that facility by as much as 20%, and they reduced changeover times by 50%. And this is stuff you see over and over again in manufacturing. You just don't see it as often within pharmaceutical or drug manufacturing as you would expect. And like any good lean project or process improvement project, what they did at that point was they took what they learned there and they started and tweaked it and then started applying those lean improvement processes to other plants across their network. Tremendous success. So when we look at what pharmaceuticals plants and the industry does poorly or does well, one of the things they do actually pretty well is making sure that they're paying attention to human resources. What we found when we looked at the data is that workforces within pharmaceutical plants are in general pretty well trained, pretty well empowered, pretty well engaged. You got about 2/3 who have empowered a majority of their production workforces. You got a little over 60% who are fully engaged in the improvement methodology, whatever they actually are doing. And you've got over 70% that train their employees at a world-class level. And in our view, a world-class level, for looking at a lot of different industries, is 40 hours or more per employee per year. And then you've got just lots of HR practices and programs that are pretty standard within the industry, at over 70%, from whether it's training or bonus plans, annual reviews, medical benefits, et cetera. So you've got lots of good stuff going on in this industry here. And this is really important because this is an industry where, especially as you start to improve, you're going to need to invest in this. And one of the firms in this industry that is very well known for this is Genentech, ranked number 11 on Fortune's 100 best companies to work for. Employees rate the company very, very highly. And I want to stress that one of the things that great companies do is they do a lot of surveys of employees of how are we doing, what can we do better. And they have a lot of really leading edge perks, including sabbaticals for all employees, parental benefits, terrific 401k match, and a lot of lifestyle perks. They make sure that they want to make it a great place for employees to work. So that's one of the things that the industry does pretty well, and there are lots of great examples. Here's an area where maybe the industry doesn't do such a good job. When you look at best practices in supplier management or in supply chain management, in a lot of plants, what you would expect to see at a modern manufacturing plant is just not there. You've got only 14% of all plants in this industry who describe their relationship with their suppliers as being a partnership. What you still see in this industry is a lot of transaction-based, buy-sell relationships. What we have learned over the years in studying a lot of different industries is that the people who do really well with supply chain management and generate a lot of value there typically tend to do a lot of partnering and figuring out how to create win-win situations and tend to avoid either cost-based or just transaction-based relationships with suppliers. So not surprisingly, given the industry's need to focus on quality for safety, et cetera, pharmaceutical plants generally do a pretty good job assessing and documenting supplier criteria. I mean, if you look at all those things like looking at quality, delivery, productivity, et cetera, they tend to do a lot of work in documenting and assessing. And that's great, except they don't do a lot of supply chain management best practices that could make that even better and also could improve productivity and responsiveness and efficiency throughout the supply chain. You know, if you look at certification of major suppliers, you know, a little over 50%. If you look at supplier management programs, collaborative design with suppliers, sharing their forecasts with suppliers, all well below 50%. These are clear areas where these are best practices. These are best practices that we have seen work in industry after industry, and you just don't see them to the extent that you would expect within this industry, especially an industry that is relatively well funded. An example of a company that has put emphasis here and has seen some great results is BristolMyersSquibb. And they had a situation with their supply chain where almost everybody in their supply chain was working from a different plan. You know, you were working in a different unit or in a plant. You had very little visibility beyond your plant and certainly into what other plants or units were doing. Nobody was on the same page with metrics. There was different reporting. Literally some data would be looked at and interpreted one way and had one meaning at one site, and at a different site it would be interpreted differently. And this obviously led to a huge amount of difference and variation in the way that people plan. So what they did was they put a tremendous effort into figuring out how are we going to create one global supply chain plan with visibility into supply chain data across the entire network, with standard metrics that have the same meaning for everybody, and with minimum standards for all key processes relating to supply chain. Now, this is not easy, as you might imagine. They had to come up with a 6-step plan in which they developed the case for change, envision the future, identify the gaps, build a roadmap, design the project, establish a change management program. And they have seen really good results with this, and they actually believe that the benefits of this were likely underestimated and understated in the original business case. So a tremendous success here. Another area where, just interestingly enough, you don't see as much emphasis as you might is in sustainability. This doesn't seem to be a major focus at a lot of pharmaceutical plants. You've got only, for example, 29% who say that it's important, and you've got close to 60% who say it's of minor importance. You see a few things here and there that they're doing, where they're energy management, recycling, reuse. But again, this is not a place of major emphasis. Obviously, this is going to be an important component for most manufacturers in most places in the world, and one where this industry will probably have to up its game a little bit over the next several years. Pfizer is an example of a company that has recognized this and is investing in this right now. They believe that EHS, that's environment, health, and safety, success and performance occurs when it is integrated into the business and it is part of everybody's responsibilities. What they've done to make sure this happens is they've actually set up an EHS governance framework and program in which they state their commitment, but more important than that, they've got assignments. There's a senior leader responsible for EHS strategy. They've got an EHS management system, which is set up like an improvement methodology. It's built on the PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. They do routine internal audits. They do third-party verifications with standards such as ISO or OHSAS, and they disclose any compliance non-conformances to make sure that they're holding themselves accountable to themselves, their employees, and their communities, and have seen good success with this. This is, again, this is the old Peter Drucker thing. What gets measured gets managed. What gets managed gets better. So I think I know we've got some time for questions here, but one of the things I want to stress is that this continuous improvement is important in any business. But this is a business that has sort of a unique responsibility to its customers, to the world in general, because there are a few business sectors that make as much of a difference in so many people's lives, which means it is also a business that is under intense scrutiny. You've got a bunch of players who obviously always want new solutions, new medications faster, they want them cheaper and better, but those have to be done in a way that's safe. One of the things that is striking about this industry is that even though the way that safety and quality is being managed here, it's being done in a way which, frankly, some of it does not conform with what you would see as leading practice in other industries. And there is a huge opportunity for pharmaceutical manufacturers, drug manufacturers, to take what they're doing now to adopt and benchmark other industries, adopt some of these best practices, and probably improve their safety and quality performance while also improving their bottom lines. And my hope for everybody on this call is that you can take a look at this benchmark data, take a look at what some of these best practices are, both within the industry and in other industries as well, and have that happen for your firm, because it's good not just for you, it's good for everybody else as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Carolyn and see if we've got time for some questions.
Thank you so much, John. Wow. These details and the metrics you provided today are certainly insightful, and we appreciate your best practices insight. We do have some time to answer questions, and I have received 2 or 3 that we'll get started with. So the first one is for you, John. Are you seeing process improvement among pharma companies outside of the plant floor?
We are, but it's sort of like what's happening on the plant floor, in that, in the same way that pharma plants, frankly, pharma companies have been a little slow to adopt some of the process improvement methodologies we've seen in other industries. They've been a little slow with some of the other issues. One big opportunity that we see out there for this industry is revenue management, with which they could, make sure they improve their management and enforcement of contracts, incentives, and rebates, do that a little more rapidly, a little more quickly, which leads to happier customers and, frankly, improved profitability.
Thank you. Question 2, are there technologies that are underutilized currently in pharmaceutical plants?
Yes, and this, and I want to stress that pharmaceutical plants in this regard are not alone here. This happens across manufacturing. One of the biggest stories in manufacturing, and as much hype as there's probably not even enough hype about how much this is going to change manufacturing over the next 5 or 10 years, relates to the Internet of Things, the IoT. And just 2-3 years ago, you had a lot of managers in this industry, other industries, frankly, too, who weren't even familiar with the IoT. Now you've got a lot of industries, including pharmaceutical, where people are rushing to figure out how are we going to connect our machines to the enterprise, to communicate data there so we can improve quality, cost, speed, energy management, asset management, all things like that. And yet, when we look across industries, including the pharmaceutical industry, even as people are saying they're going to spend more money on this, invest more, a lot of people aren't exactly sure how to leverage this. This is a huge opportunity. We also we expect almost every industry to be taking a look at additive manufacturing, especially any industry that's capital intensive, figuring out how to create replacement parts, reducing inventory, different things. Even if they're not using it for the product they're producing, they may start doing it to actually manage some of their equipment and their assets. If you look at, we just did a study last year on the Internet of Things. We had about 71% of executives said they had not yet adopted an Internet of Things strategy. We even had 30% who hadn't even heard of it yet. And yet this is something I think that's going to change manufacturing dramatically over the next several years.
Thank you. Okay, another question. With OnePiece Flow in this kind of industry, is there a risk that you're going to introduce contamination issues?
There's always a risk of that, sure. And I want to stress, I want to stress that that is. First of all, I want to stress that I don't want anybody, obviously, to do anything that is going to cause some problems with safety or quality or contamination. That said, there are lots of industries that are managing like this. I mean, contamination is an issue not just in this industry; it's in the semiconductor, wafer industry, and another number of industries there. So there are ways to do that that can minimize that. But yeah, it is a real concern.
Thank you. So another question's come in. How viable is the 3D printing and big data in the pharmacy supply chain?
I would say that right now big data is absolutely viable right now and is a huge issue right now, in part because the data is, with the IoT and with increasing amounts of machines, production, whether it's office equipment, machines, et cetera, gathering data right now, the data is there. What we're not seeing is people leveraging that effectively yet, except in some industries. And there is lots that can be done. I mean, imagine just being able to analyze, for example, on the demand side, billions of prescriptions and you know, what's coming in, how demand is managed, et cetera, how that is translated back through the supply chain. Additive manufacturing, we're seeing a lot of that in other industries. I think it is nascent within this industry, but I think you're going to see that happening over the next 10 years. Certainly big data and the IoT first, though.
Thank you. Another question. Have you perceived a difference between plants in the emerging markets and plants in other markets?
I don't have enough data on that right now to make a statement on that. So right now I can't say. I have some theories, but I usually like to have data before I make an opinion.
I understand. Thank you. Okay. Do you have any information on where the investments in new manufacturing plants are occurring within the U.S. or in other areas? And I think that's what you just said. You don't really have that data, whether it's the investments are being made inside the U.S. or outside of the U.S.
There's a lot of both, and there's actually a fair amount of secondary data that can be culled for that. So, and I think when people get a copy of this presentation, all the stats are footnoted, and some of that is from some secondary sources.
Okay. Next question: will patient centricity and end-to-end supply chain management reduce the high inventory level hold in the supply chain?
Could you repeat that question? It winked out for just a minute.
Will patient centricity and end-to-end supply chain management reduce the high inventory level hold in the chain?
It has in any other industry. I think there are some unique components within this industry, but most of them, the unique aspects are not so unique that it's going to prevent their adoption. Absolutely it will. The issue, though, is, you know, this is an industry that typically doesn't do a lot of collaboration along the supply chain.
Okay. How are pharma companies transferring from an inventory driven by production to an inventory based on customer demand?
Part of it is just the adoption of best practices, but there is frankly a huge technological component. Making sure that you're collecting data in ways that are useful, sharing it along, and using data analytics, big data, data analytics.
How about 3D printing in investment by multinationals? Do you have any exposure to that?
I don't have data on that, so I don't want to comment on that.
Okay. That is the last question that I have at this point, unless someone wants to submit a new one. Otherwise, I think that that's the end of our Q&A session. Oh, wait a minute. Here comes one. What is then the optimal supply chain model and network to overcome the complexity in the pharma sector?
Repeat that question again.
What is the optimal supply chain model and network to overcome the complexity in the pharma sector?
I don't know that there is an optimal structure. I think that's going to vary by firm. It's going to vary by which countries are you selling into? Is exclusivity still there? How is the funding model, et cetera? So there's not one model. I do think that just across this, though, there's just a paucity of best practices at many of these firms.
Okay. I think that's the end of our questions. If we do have any questions that come in after the broadcast is complete, we'll make certain that we get those assimilated and sent out. I want to thank all of you for attending today. We really hope that you found value in your time with us. I know I certainly have learned a great deal from the information that John and the MPI group has presented today. If you'd like more information about the content provided, please feel free to reach out to either John or me, Carolyn Lawrence. using the contact details we're providing here. Please note that we have recorded this session, and we will be providing the link to the recording to all participants. Also, if you'd like more information on how APICS can work with you to transform and improve your supply chains using many of the tools that John's described today, please feel free to reach out to me. I thank you again for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.